Okay, it's part 3 of my series on muscles. And today I'm going to focus on the structure and the function of muscle fibers. Now, specifically, we're going to look at the major components of a muscle cell that are unique to muscle cells that are required to help it contract, okay? Because muscles are really unique in their ability to change shape. Now, of course, a skeletal muscle like your bicep is a type of muscle tissue, and it's got this muscle fascia consisting of the fascia with the fascicles, and then the fascicles are made up by the individual muscle fibers. Now, to make sure that we're all on the same page, a muscle fiber is a muscle cell, which is also a myocyte. So if you think muscle cell, that's also muscle fiber. And from here on out, I'm going to refer to muscle cells simply as a muscle fiber. So if I say muscle fiber, think muscle cell. So let's take a closer look here. First of all, each of our muscle fibers are surrounded by a fascia called the endomysium. Endo, of course, means within. So this is, it's tough. It's made of collagen, right? So it makes our muscle cells very strong. And it's part of the extracellular matrix. So it's outside the muscle cell, okay? It's outside the cellular membrane of the muscle. Now, muscle fibers, unlike many other cells in our body, they're big. They're really big. And they can be quite long, up to 30 centimeters long. So if you take your longest muscle in your body, you're going to have a muscle fiber run the entire length of that muscle fiber, of that muscle tissue. So that's pretty long, right? Think of your hamstrings or your quadriceps. You've got a single muscle fiber running the entire length. That's a big cell. And also, the muscle fibers can also vary in their thickness depending on the sizes of other structures inside of them. And they can be up to 100 micrometers in thickness. And of course, that depends also on our genetics and how much we exercise as well. Now, muscle cells have unique components, and in fact, we also label some of the components that are similar to other cells with different names to denote that they are a muscle cell. In a generalized cell, or all cells for that matter, they are surrounded by the plasma membrane. The phospholipid bilayer, the cell membrane, it doesn't matter, they're all the same things. Now, when we get to a muscle cell, okay, we call that the sarcolemma, which has to do, sarco means like flesh, lemma is a circular structure around it. So instead of saying the plasma membrane, we're going to refer to the cellular membrane of a muscle cell as the sarcolemma, okay? You also have, instead of cytoplasm, there's the sarcoplasm. Most eukaryotic cells, or actually all eukaryotic cells, have an endoplasmic reticulum, both rough for making proteins, and then the smooth for making lipids and detoxifying things. But in a muscle cell, we have a sarcoplasmic reticulum. And both cells also store mitochondria. Mitochondria, of course, as you well know, are very important for making ATP. And in fact, the majority of our ATP comes from the mitochondria. And so our muscle cells are loaded with mitochondria, allowing them to contract. And of course, muscle cells have nucleus. In fact, they have mini nucleus, and that allows them to have control over various regions. Let's take a closer look here. I just ended with that multiple nucleus. Most cells only have one nucleus. That's the brain of your cell, right? It coordinates all the activities of a cell. Well, most cells only have one because they're quite small. So the directions of the nucleus can be carried out within that individual cell rapidly. But if you've got a muscle cell this long, and you've got this tiny little nucleus up here on this end, there's basically no way that a signal from the nucleus here is going to reach the other end of the cell. So what happens is you've got the myoblasts, and of course the myoblasts are the immature muscle cells. They fuse and form the muscle fiber. So you now have a multinucleated cell. So each nucleus can control a various region of the muscle cell, okay? So that's why they have lots of nuclei, because they're very long, and they get them from the fusion of the myoblast, so that the individual nuclei, so that they can control independent regions of that cell, or localized regions, not independent regions, sorry. Oh, I'm in front of the terminal cisternae. Let's talk about the parts of a muscle fiber that are very important for muscle contraction. Now, to be clear, I'm not going to talk about how a cell contracts or how these muscles contract right now. This is just going through the parts list, kind of describing what they're going to do. And my next lecture will discuss how a cell actually contracts, or specifically how the myofibrils contract. So here it is, the parts of a muscle cell that you'll need to know. First, it's a myofibril. Second, the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Third, the transverse tubules, also known as the T-tubules. And then third, the terminal cisternae. Sorry, I'm standing right in front of that. I tried to fix that earlier. So what is a myofibril? Well, myofibrils are a unique structure to cells. They're an organelle, and a cell can have hundreds to thousands of these myofibrils, okay? And they're made up of mostly contractile proteins. And you guys are going, I know what a contractile protein is. That's your actin. That's your myosin, right? Those are two of the important contractile proteins that allow the myofibril to actually contract and shorten. And that will be a discussion on my next lecture, how the myofibrils actually contract. But let's continue on with our parts list. The second one is very important, is the sarcoplasmic reticulum. This is part of the smooth ER, okay? Now the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, and what it does is it stores calcium ions. And this is very important because for the muscle to contract, okay, for the myofibrils to actually shorten, requires calcium. And I'll get into that in my next lecture, the role of calcium in a muscle contraction. But the sarcoplasmic reticulum, it surrounds the myofibrils, okay? So it stores calcium, it releases calcium, and then it will pump the calcium out of the sarcoplasm back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Next, we have these transverse tubules. I'm going to call them T-tubules from now on. And these are extensions from the sarcolemma. So remember, sarcolemma, that's our cellular membrane surrounding our muscle cell, surrounding our muscle fiber, right? Okay, so that means that you have this extracellular matrix, and so this is surrounded by, and so the T-tubules, they form this tunnel-like network through the muscle fiber, okay? And they get right up next to the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And they're continuous with the exterior, okay? And this is very important that they're continuous. This allows, or the T-tubules allow, for a rapid conduction of an action potential into a muscle cell. I mean, we've known since the 1800s that, you know, if you just had a signal at the sarcolemma of the cell, we know that it's excitable, but the signal couldn't travel through the sarcoplasm fast enough for a muscle contraction that we see today, for the speed of what a muscle can contract. So basically, these things allow that signal, the action potential, to rapidly travel through the muscle cell, okay? And in hearts, in cardiac muscle, the T-tubule is even larger than in our skeletal muscle, which makes sense because it allows for the heart to rapidly contract. Now, one more part. This is going back to the sarcoplasmic reticulum. That stores calcium ions. Calcium ions are needed for muscle contraction. So at the ends of these sarcoplasmic reticulum are what we call the terminal cisternae. Okay, they're just in large parts of the SR, and they're flanking the T-tubules. Well, that makes sense, right? If the T-tubule is going to help propagate the signal to contract into the muscle, and you need to release calcium ions for the muscle cell to contract, then of course you would have your terminal cisternae holding all the calcium ions right next to the T-tubule, so you can have a signal rapidly release those calcium ions, causing a muscle contraction. Okay, so I just talked about this. So they are storing lots of calcium here in the terminal cisternae. Now, when you get the T-tubule surrounded on each side by the terminal cisternae that forms a triad. And a muscle fiber might have thousands of these triads. Okay, you can think thousands of triads. This is thousands of areas where we're going to release calcium to cause a muscle to contract. So next up, we're going to take a closer look at the myofibril. We're going to look at its structure and its function to see how it contracts. And then, of course, my last video will be, okay, so stay curious until next time.